The sound of a woman's labored breathing cut through the dusty morning air of Sloan, Nevada, a town barely clinging to life in the unforgiving desert of 1881. Grace Murphy clutched her swollen belly as she stumbled down the wooden sidewalk, her worn boots catching on the uneven planks while the July sun beat down mercilessly on her bonnet-covered head. She was 8 months along with twins, and the weight of them pressed against her spine like two stones grinding her into dust. Her husband had been dead for 3 months now, killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts, and the 2 lives growing inside her that she had no idea how to provide for. Grace steadied herself against a hitching post outside the general store, her breath coming in short gasps. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer and dance above the packed dirt streets. She needed water, needed rest, needed so many things she could not afford. The store owner had extended her credit as far as he would allow, and now she owed him nearly $20 with no way to pay it back. Her small house on the edge of town would be taken by the bank within the month if she could not come up with the mortgage payment. And here she was, round as a barrel with 2 babies who would need food and clothing, and everything else that cost money she did not have. A tall figure emerged from the shadows of the general store, and Grace looked up to see a man watching her with concern etched across his weathered face. He was somewhere in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar, and eyes the color of the sage that grew wild in the hills surrounding Sloan. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, dusty from the trail, with worn leather chaps over his denim trousers and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. "Madam, are you all right?" His voice was deep and gentle, the kind of voice that reminded Grace of her father reading to her by lamplight when she was a child. She tried to straighten up, to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. "I am fine, thank you," but her body betrayed her words. Her knees buckled slightly, and before she could fall, the cowboy was at her side, his strong hand supporting her elbow and helping her regain her balance. The concern in his eyes deepened as he took in her condition, the way her dress strained across her belly, the exhaustion written in every line of her face. "With respect, madam, you do not look fine. When was the last time you had something to drink? Something to eat?" He guided her toward a bench in front of the store, and she was too tired to resist. Grace sank onto the rough wood with a sigh that came from deep in her bones. "I have had water this morning." "And food?" She did not answer, which was answer enough. The cowboy studied her for a moment, then disappeared into the general store without another word. Grace sat there feeling foolish and helpless, 2 emotions she had become far too familiar with since Thomas died. She had been a teacher before they married, educated and capable, but pregnancy and widowhood had stripped away the independence she once possessed. Now she was just another woman in desperate circumstances, in a town that had seen too many desperate people to care much about one more. The cowboy returned carrying a canteen and a paper-wrapped package. He uncorked the canteen and handed it to her, waiting while she drank deeply of the cool water. It must have come from the store's ice cellar, and it tasted like salvation. When she finished, he opened the package to reveal fresh bread and cheese, and her stomach cramped with hunger at the sight of it. "I cannot pay you," she said, hating the words even as they left her mouth. "I did not ask you to." He broke off a piece of bread and handed it to her. "My name is Grant O'Brien. I have been working on the Running Horse Ranch about 10 miles north of here, but I am between jobs at the moment, and you are Grace Murphy." She took the bread, her hands trembling slightly. Pride warred with need, and need won because the babies inside her were hungry even if she wanted to refuse charity. My husband died in April. Cave in at the silver mine. Grant's expression softened with understanding rather than pity, and she was grateful for that small mercy. I am sorry for your loss. Do you have family here? Someone to help you? Grace shook her head, chewing slowly to make the food last. We came here from Missouri 2 years ago. Thomas heard there was silver in the hills and he thought we could make our fortune. But the only ones making fortunes are the mine owners, and they do not even live here. They stay in San Francisco and count their money while men die in the dark. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She had been raised to accept hardship with grace, to trust that the Lord had a plan even when that plan seemed cruel beyond measure. But sitting here, 8 months pregnant with twins and no way to provide for them, it was hard to see any plan except disaster. Grant settled onto the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. What will you do when the babies come? Survive. It was the only answer she had. A woman in town, Mrs. Chen, has said she will attend the birth. After that, I suppose I will find work somewhere, somehow. Perhaps I can take in laundry or sewing. With 2 newborns to care for. Grant's tone was not judgmental, just realistic. That will be difficult. Everything is difficult. Grace finished the bread and cheese, feeling slightly more human now that she had food in her stomach. But difficult has never killed anyone. It just makes life harder, and life was already hard, so it is just more of the same. Grant was quiet for a moment, watching the sparse foot traffic on Sloan's Main Street. A wagon rattled past, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. Somewhere a dog barked, and from one of the saloons came the tinny sound of an out-of-tune piano. It was a Tuesday morning, which meant most of the miners were underground, and most of the ranch hands were out with their herds, leaving the town feeling empty and forgotten beneath the relentless Nevada sun. I have a proposition for you, Grant said finally, turning to look at her directly. And I want you to hear me out before you say no. Grace's guard went up immediately. She had learned in the months since Thomas died that men who offered propositions to desperate women usually had less than honorable intentions, no matter how kind their faces seemed. I am not interested in certain kinds of arrangements. Nothing like that. Grant held up his hands as if to prove he meant no harm. I am talking about something practical. You need help, and I find myself in a position to offer it. I have saved most of my wages from the past 5 years of working cattle. I have enough to rent a decent house, buy supplies, and see us through the next several months without worry. What I do not have is a reason to stay in one place, a reason to build something instead of just drifting from job to job. I do not understand what you are proposing. Grace's heart was beating faster, though whether from hope or fear she could not say. Marriage. Grant said the word plainly, without romance or flowery language. A practical arrangement between 2 people who need something the other can provide. You need support and stability, especially with twins on the way. I need a reason to stop wandering, to build a real life instead of just existing. We could help each other. Grace stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. Marriage to a complete stranger was not something she had ever imagined, but then again, she had never imagined being widowed and pregnant and destitute either. Life had a way of destroying expectations and replacing them with harsh necessities. You do not even know me, she said. I could be a terrible person, cruel or lazy or any number of bad things. Could be, Grant agreed, but I do not think so. I have been watching you since I rode into town yesterday. You were helping old Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries home, even though you can barely carry yourself. You stopped to pet that stray dog everyone else kicks out of their way. You said please and thank you to the store clerk, even though he was rude to you about your unpaid account. Those things tell me what kind of person you are. You were watching me. Grace did not know whether to be flattered or disturbed. Not in a strange way, Grant said quickly. I just noticed you, that is all. And when I asked around about you, everyone said you were kind and honest and that your husband's death was a tragedy. They also said you were in dire straits, and when I saw you this morning looking like you were about to collapse, I thought maybe I could help. Grace looked down at her hands, work roughened and reddened from the lye soap. She used to wash clothes for the few customers who would hire a pregnant woman. Grant's offer was outrageous, completely improper, and possibly the answer to prayers she had been too afraid to even pray. But it was also terrifying in its implications. She would be binding herself to another stranger, just as she had bound herself to Thomas when she was 19 and he was 22, and they both thought they knew what love meant. "Why would you want this?" she asked. "There must be women in town, unmarried women without complications, who would be happy to accept a proposal from a man with steady work and savings." Grant leaned back against the storefront, his eyes distant. "I am 27 years old, and I have spent the last decade moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to matter to anyone or have anyone matter to me. My parents died of fever when I was 16. I have no siblings, no family at all. I am tired of being alone, Miss Murphy. Tired of sleeping in bunkhouses with a dozen other men who will forget my name the day I leave. Tired of saving money with no purpose behind it. When I saw you yesterday, I thought here is a woman who is fighting hard to survive, who has not given up even though she has every reason to. I thought if I could help you, maybe in helping you I would help myself too. Maybe we could build something together, even if it starts as just a practical arrangement." His honesty was disarming. Grace found herself wanting to trust him, wanting to believe that this impossible offer might actually be what it seemed. But she had been naive before, and it had led her to Nevada, to Thomas, to this bench where she sat desperate and afraid. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course." Grant stood and tipped his hat to her. "I am staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street. You can find me there when you have made your decision. But Miss Murphy, do not wait too long. Those babies are going to come whether you are ready or not, and I would like to help you prepare for them if you will let me." He walked away then, his long stride eating up the distance down the sidewalk, and Grace watched him go while her mind spun with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The rest of that day passed in a blur of uncertainty. Grace returned to her small house, a 2-room structure that had seemed cozy when she and Thomas first rented it, but now felt cramped and shabby. She tried to rest as Mrs. Chen had instructed her to do, but sleep would not come. Instead, she lay on the narrow bed, feeling the babies move inside her, their small limbs pressing against her ribs and bladder in turns. They were running out of room in there, eager to be born into a world that Grace had no idea how to provide for them in. She thought about Grant's offer from every angle she could imagine. Marriage to him would solve her immediate problems. She would have a home, food, security for herself and her children. But what would she be giving up in return? Her independence, such as it was, her right to make her own choices. And what about him? What would he expect from her beyond the practical arrangement he had described? Would he want a real wife in all the ways that implied, or would they live as strangers sharing a house? The questions chased themselves in circles until Grace's head ached. She got up and made herself a cup of weak tea from the last of her supply, then sat at the small table and tried to think rationally instead of emotionally. What would happen if she said no? She would have the babies alone with only Mrs. Chen to help her. She would lose this house within weeks. She would have no money for food or clothing for the children. She might be able to find work eventually, but how could she work and care for two infants at the same time? The town had no family to take her in, no charitable organizations that could support her long term. She would be destitute, and her children would suffer for it. And if she said yes, she would be married to a stranger, true, but a stranger who had shown her more kindness in one morning than anyone else in Sloan had shown her in months. A stranger who had been honest about his motivations and had not tried to pressure her or take advantage of her desperate situation. A stranger who had kind eyes and a gentle voice, and who had spent 5 years saving his wages instead of drinking them away like so many cowboys did. By the time evening fell and the heat finally began to dissipate, Grace had made her decision. She changed into her least worn dress, a blue calico that had been let out twice to accommodate her growing belly, and made her way slowly through the darkening streets to the boarding house on 3rd Street. Her back ached with every step, and the babies seemed to be having some kind of wrestling match inside her, but she pressed on. If she was going to do this, she needed to do it before fear changed her mind. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Hartley, a sharp-eyed woman who nonetheless had a reputation for fairness. Grace knocked on the door and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to make her breathless. Mrs. Hartley answered and looked her up and down with an expression that managed to be both concerned and curious. "Miss Murphy, what brings you here at this hour?" "I am looking for Grant O'Brien. He said he was staying here." Mrs. Hartley's eyebrows rose slightly. "He is. Is this about something urgent?" "Yes, madam. If you could tell him I am here, I would be grateful." The widow nodded and disappeared back into the house, leaving Grace standing on the porch feeling exposed and foolish. But before doubt could take hold, Grant appeared in the doorway. He had cleaned up since she saw him that morning, his hair still damp from washing and his shirt changed to a clean one. The concern on his face when he saw her was immediate. "Miss Murphy, is something wrong? The babies?" "No, nothing like that." Grace took a breath to steady herself. "I have thought about your offer. If it still stands, my answer is yes." Grant's expression shifted through surprise to something that looked like relief. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close behind him. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel pressured into this." "I am as certain as I can be about anything anymore." Grace met his eyes steadily. "But I need to know what you expect from this arrangement. You said it would be practical, but marriage means different things to different people. I need to understand what it will mean to you." Grant nodded slowly. "That is fair. Here is what I am thinking. We marry soon, within the next few days if possible. I will rent us a proper house, something with space for the babies and a yard for them to play in as they grow. I will find work, and I will provide for all of us. In return, I would hope for companionship, for someone to talk to at the end of the day, for a real home instead of just a place to sleep. As for the more intimate aspects of marriage, I will leave that entirely to you. I will not force myself on you or expect anything you are not willing to give. If in time we develop real affection for each other, then perhaps things will change. But for now, I am content with a partnership based on respect and mutual support." The knot of fear in Grace's chest loosened slightly. "And the babies, they are not yours. You will be taking on the responsibility of raising another man's children." "They will be my children from the moment we marry," Grant said firmly. "I will love them and care for them as if they were my own blood. That is a promise, Miss Murphy. I do not make promises lightly." Grace studied his face in the dim light from the boarding house windows, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But all she saw was sincerity and a quiet strength that reminded her of the oak trees that had grown near her childhood home in Missouri, solid and enduring. She made her choice then, fully and completely, because sometimes the only way forward was to trust that not everyone in the world was cruel or selfish. "Then let us marry," she said, "as soon as it can be arranged." Grant smiled, and it transformed his whole face from merely handsome to genuinely warm. "Thank you for trusting me. I know this is not how anyone dreams their marriage will start, but I promise I will do everything I can to make it a good life for you and the babies." They married 3 days later in a brief ceremony at the small church on the edge of Sloan. The minister was a Methodist circuit rider who happened to be passing through town, and the witnesses were Mrs. Chen and the general store owner, who had agreed to forgive Grace's debt as a wedding present. Grace wore her best dress, a green cotton that had belonged to her mother and still fit through the shoulders even if the middle had to be left mostly open. Grant wore a new shirt he had purchased for the occasion and had gotten a proper haircut from the town barber. The ceremony was simple and quick, with none of the romance or celebration that usually accompanied weddings. But when Grant slipped a plain gold band onto Grace's finger and the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Grace felt something shift inside her. It was not love, not yet, but it was hope, and that was more than she had felt in a very long time. After the ceremony, Grant took her to see the house he had rented. It was on the north side of town, away from the noise and dust of the main street, with 2 proper bedrooms and a kitchen that had a real stove instead of just a fireplace. There was a yard with a few scraggly trees that provided some shade, and a well with good water that did not have to be carried from the town pump. It was more than Grace had dared to hope for. "I know it is not a palace," Grant said as he helped her up the porch steps, ever mindful of her balance. "But it is solid and clean, and there is room for the babies. It is wonderful." Grace ran her hand along the porch rail, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palm. "I have not had a place this nice since I left my parents' home." They spent the rest of the day settling in. Grant had already moved his few belongings into the smaller bedroom, leaving the larger one for Grace and the babies. He had purchased a cradle from a family whose children had outgrown it, and it sat in the corner of the bedroom, already lined with soft blankets. There were supplies in the kitchen, enough food to last them weeks, and everything they would need for the babies when they arrived. As evening fell, they sat together at the small kitchen table and ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Grant had prepared. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was uncertain, the silence of 2 people who were legally bound but still strangers to each other in most ways that mattered. "Tell me about yourself," Grant said as he refilled her water glass. "I know the basic facts, but I would like to know more. What was your life like before you came to Nevada?" Grace considered the question while she ate. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her past with genuine interest, rather than mere curiosity about her circumstances. "I grew up in a small town in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children. My father was a school teacher, and he made sure all of us could read and write and do figures. I became a teacher, too, at the school in our town. I met Thomas when he came through looking for work at the mill. He was charming and full of big dreams about making something of himself out west. I was 20 when we married, and we left for Nevada right after the wedding." "Do you regret it?" Grant asked. "Coming here, I mean." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that Thomas died. I regret that his dreams never came true. But I do not regret the journey itself. If I had stayed in Missouri, I would have lived my whole life in the same small town, teaching the same lessons year after year, never seeing anything new or different. There is value in that kind of life, but I think I would have felt trapped by it eventually. At least here I have seen different things, lived different ways, even if those ways have been harder than I expected." Grant nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. I left home because I had to after my parents died, but even if they had lived, I think I would have gone eventually. There is something about movement, about seeing new places and meeting new people, that feels necessary to me. But there is also something exhausting about it, about never having roots anywhere. Is that why you offered to marry me? Grace asked. Because you wanted roots, partly. Grant met her eyes across the table. But it was more than that. When I saw you yesterday, struggling but not giving up, I recognized something in you. A strength that I admire. I thought if I was going to put down roots anywhere, with anyone, I would want it to be with someone strong enough to weather whatever storms come. Does that make sense? It does. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten. It was not love, but it was connection, and that was its own kind of gift. Thank you for seeing strength in me. Most people just see a desperate woman. Then most people are not looking properly. Grant stood and began clearing the table. You should rest, Mrs. Chen said you need to stay off your feet as much as possible these last few weeks. Grace wanted to protest, to help with the cleaning, but her body betrayed her with a wave of exhaustion that made her bones feel like lead. She allowed Grant to help her to the bedroom, and she lay down on the real bed with its real mattress and clean sheets that smelled of soap and sunshine. Through the open door, she could hear Grant moving around the kitchen, the domestic sounds of dishes being washed and put away. And for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something like safety. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Grace with its comfort. Grant found work at the Running Horse Ranch where he had been employed before, riding out each morning before dawn and returning in the late afternoon covered in dust, but never too tired to ask about her day and help with whatever needed doing around the house. He was quiet but not silent, sharing stories about the ranch and the other cowboys while they ate dinner together. He fixed the loose board on the porch and reinforced the fence around the yard. He was patient and kind and kept his word about not pressuring her for anything beyond companionship. Grace, for her part, did what she could to make their arrangement feel like a real home rather than just a practical agreement. She cooked meals with the supplies Grant provided, mended his clothes when they needed it, and slowly began to share more of herself with him. They talked about books they had read, places they had been, dreams they had harbored before life taught them that dreams were luxuries few could afford. And gradually, almost without Grace noticing it happening, Grant stopped being a stranger and started being simply Grant, the man she ate breakfast with, who remembered that she liked honey in her tea, who worried about her when the babies kicked hard enough to make her wince. The babies came on a sweltering August night when the heat had not diminished even after the sun set. Grace woke from restless sleep, feeling wetness between her legs and a tightening in her belly that made her gasp. She called out for Grant, and he was there within seconds, still dressed because he had been sitting up reading by lamplight in the main room. "The babies are coming," Grace managed to say through gritted teeth as another contraction seized her. "We need Mrs. Chen." Grant did not panic. He helped Grace sit up, spoke to her in a calm voice that cut through her rising fear, then went to fetch the midwife while Grace tried to remember everything she had been told about breathing and staying calm. Mrs. Chen arrived within 20 minutes, her weathered face serene and confident as she took over the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had attended hundreds of births. The labor was long and brutal, stretching through the night and into the next day. Grace had known it would be difficult, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. The pain came in waves that drowned her, pulled her under until she was sure she could not survive another moment. Mrs. Chen was a steady presence, checking on her progress, helping her change positions, offering sips of water and encouraging words. And Grant was there too, which surprised Grace because men usually had no part in birthing rooms. But he held her hand when she needed something to squeeze, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, and never once flinched away from her suffering even though she could see the worry in his eyes. The first baby, a boy, was born just after noon on that second day, his cries strong and healthy despite being slightly smaller than Mrs. Chen had expected. Grant cleaned him gently while Mrs. Chen attended to Grace, who had only moments to rest before the contractions began again for the second twin. This baby took longer, and there were moments when Grace was certain she could not do it, could not survive this, could not possibly have enough strength left. But Mrs. Chen was firm and encouraging, and Grant was there saying, "You can do this, Grace. You are the strongest person I know. Just a little more." The second baby, another boy, was born as the sun began to set, painting the bedroom in shades of orange and gold. He was smaller than his brother, his cries weaker, and Mrs. Chen's face grew concerned as she examined him. But after a few tense minutes, his breathing steadied and his color improved, and the midwife pronounced him small but healthy, likely to catch up to his brother with time and good feeding. Grace lay exhausted beyond measure, her body feeling like it had been torn apart and roughly stitched back together. But when Mrs. Chen placed both babies in her arms, wrapped in clean blankets and squinting up at her with unfocused newborn eyes, she felt a surge of fierce love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. These were her sons, Thomas's sons, and now they would be Grant's sons too, if he meant what he had promised. She looked up to find Grant staring at the babies with an expression of wonder and something that looked like awe. He reached out tentatively, and Grace shifted to let him touch one tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled automatically around Grant's calloused finger, and Grace saw her husband's eyes grow bright with unshed tears. "They are perfect," Grant said, his voice rough with emotion. "What will you name them?" Grace had thought about names during the long months of pregnancy, but she had never settled on anything definite. She looked down at the babies, trying to see them as individuals rather than just the weight she had been carrying. The firstborn had dark hair like Thomas, while the second had lighter hair that reminded her of her own father. They were so small, so vulnerable, so completely dependent on her and Grant to keep them safe in a world that had already proven itself harsh and unforgiving. "Samuel," she said, indicating the firstborn, "and Joseph for his brother." "Samuel and Joseph," Grant repeated, testing the names. "Those are good, strong names. They suit them." He looked at Grace, and his expression was earnest and open. "Thank you for letting me be part of this. I know I am not their father by blood, but I meant what I said. I will love them as if they were my own." "I know." Grace believed him completely, which was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. "You have already proven yourself more than I had any right to hope for." Mrs. Chen stayed through the evening to make sure Grace was recovering properly, and to show her how to feed the twins, a process that was awkward and painful and oddly moving all at once. By the time the midwife left, promising to check on them the next day, Grace was asleep sitting up with Samuel at her breast, and Grant was walking the floor with Joseph, who had decided to exercise his surprisingly powerful lungs. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and adjustment. Newborn twins, Grace discovered, were exponentially more work than she had imagined. They needed to be fed constantly, changed constantly, soothed constantly. Samuel was the easier of the two, content to sleep between feedings and rarely crying without clear cause. Joseph was more demanding, prone to fussing and crying even when his needs had been met, and Grace often found herself walking the floor with him in the middle of the night, singing softly while he finally settled against her shoulder. Grant helped in ways Grace had not expected. He took night shifts with the babies so she could sleep, becoming expert at changing diapers and preparing bottles of goat milk when Grace's own milk was not enough to satisfy two hungry infants. He built a second cradle so each boy could have his own space. He was endlessly patient with Joseph's crying and celebrated Samuel's rare smiles as if they were great victories. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks, Grace watched him become a father in every way that mattered. One evening when the babies were 3 weeks old and sleeping peacefully for once, Grace and Grant sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the distant hills. The August heat had finally broken, and the evening air was almost pleasant. Grant had his arm resting along the back of the bench they shared, not quite touching Grace but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I never thanked you properly," Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence, "for all of this. The house, your help with the boys, everything you have done." Grant shook his head. "You do not need to thank me. This is what I wanted: a family, a home, a purpose beyond just drifting from place to place. You gave me that as much as I gave you security." Still, Grace turned to look at him, really look at him. The last month had been so consumed with the pregnancy and birth and care of the twins that she had not taken time to truly see the man she had married. He had laugh lines around his eyes despite the serious nature of his work. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard labor, but gentle when they held her sons. There was gray just beginning to show at his temples, even though he was still young. He was handsome in an understated way, the kind of face that grew more attractive the more familiar it became. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That I am grateful," Grace said honestly. "And that I am starting to feel like this is real. Our marriage, I mean, not just a practical arrangement but something more." Grant's expression grew serious. "I have felt that way for a while now. You are easy to care for, Grace. Easy to admire. I know we started this as strangers, but I find myself hoping that we will not stay strangers forever." Grace felt her heart beat faster. She had been so focused on survival, on the immediate needs of her situation, that she had not allowed herself to think about the possibility of real affection growing between them. But Grant was right. Something had shifted in the weeks since their marriage, in the intimate domesticity of caring for newborns together, of sharing meals and conversations, and the daily details of life. She found herself looking forward to his return from work each day, found comfort in his presence, found safety in knowing he was there. "I do not think we are strangers anymore," she said quietly. "I think we are becoming something else, something better." Grant reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough against hers, and the touch sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. "I would like that very much." They sat there as darkness fell, holding hands like courting sweethearts instead of a couple married out of necessity, and Grace felt something unfurl inside her chest. It was tentative and fragile, this new feeling, but it was undeniably there. She was beginning to fall for her husband, this kind cowboy who had offered to carry her burdens with her, and had proven himself true to his word in every way that mattered. As autumn arrived, and the brutal desert heat gave way to milder temperatures, life settled into a new normal. The twins grew rapidly, gaining weight and developing distinct personalities. Samuel remained the calmer of the two, observant and content to watch the world around him with serious eyes. Joseph was energetic and demanding, always wanting attention and quick to complain when he felt neglected. Grant doted on both of them equally, spending his evenings playing with them and his days working hard to provide for their growing family. Grace found herself healing, both physically from the difficult birth and emotionally, from the trauma of losing Thomas and facing destitution. The constant fear that had been her companion for months began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism about the future. She and Grant grew closer as the weeks passed, their conversations deepening, their silences growing more comfortable. He told her about his childhood, about parents who had loved him deeply before fever took them, about the loneliness of the years that followed. She told him about her family, about the dreams she had harbored of seeing the ocean someday, about the guilt she sometimes felt for not grieving Thomas more than she did. "You cannot control how you feel," Grant said when she confessed this to him one night after the babies were asleep. "Thomas died, and that was tragic, but he is gone and you are still here. You have to live your life, Grace. I do not think less of you for wanting to be happy again." "Did you ever love someone?" Grace asked. "Before." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Once. When I was 20. A girl in Colorado where I was working a ranch. Her name was Emma, and she was the daughter of the ranch owner. We courted for 6 months, and I thought I would marry her, but her father had other plans. He wanted her to marry the son of another rancher, someone who could combine their properties and make both families wealthy. She chose to obey her father, and I left Colorado the next week. I was hurt for a long time, but eventually I realized it was for the best. She wanted security more than she wanted me, and there is nothing wrong with that. Everyone has to make their own choices about what matters most." "And what matters most to you?" Grace asked. "This." Grant gestured to the house around them, to the room where their son slept. "Family, belonging, being needed and valued by people I care about. I make enough money to keep us fed and housed, and that is sufficient. I do not need wealth or property or anything beyond what we have right here." Grace felt a surge of affection for him so strong it almost took her breath away. "You are a good man, Grant O'Brien. I am trying to be." He met her eyes, and there was warmth there and something deeper. "For you and the boys." The night of their 2-month anniversary, Grant came home from work with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Grace with an almost shy expression, and when she opened it, she found a book inside. Not just any book, but a copy of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, one of her favorite novels that she had mentioned once in passing weeks ago. "I rode into Carson City on my day off," Grant explained. "There is a bookshop there, and I remembered you saying you missed having books to read. I know things are busy with the twins, but I thought maybe you would enjoy it when you have a few quiet moments." Grace ran her hand over the cover, feeling tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had given her a gift, longer still since anyone had listened carefully enough to her casual comments to remember them and act on them. "Thank you. This is incredibly thoughtful." "You make me want to be thoughtful." Grant took a step closer to her. They were in the kitchen, the babies asleep in their cradles in the bedroom, the house quiet around them. "You make me want to be a better man than I have been. You and Samuel and Joseph." Grace looked up at him, at this man who had appeared in her life when she most needed help, and had transformed from a stranger into someone essential. Her heart was pounding, and she realized with sudden clarity that what she felt for him was no longer just gratitude or even affection. It was deeper than that, truer than that. "Grant," she said softly, "I think I am falling in love with you." His expression transformed with joy and relief. "I know I am falling in love with you. I have been for weeks now." I did not want to say anything because I did not want to pressure you, but Grace, you are everything I did not know I was looking for. You are smart and strong and kind, and you make me laugh even when I am bone tired. You make me want to come home at the end of the day. You make me want to build a real future instead of just surviving day to day." Grace set the book down on the table and stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them. "Then build it with me. Not because we made a practical arrangement, but because we want to, because we choose to. Grant cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle and reverent. I choose you, Grace, today and every day after. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the brief, awkward kiss they had shared at their wedding. This kiss was deep and slow and full of promise, the kind of kiss that marked a beginning rather than an end. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself feel everything she had been holding back, the attraction and affection and love that had been growing in her heart like a garden finally receiving rain. They pulled apart eventually, both breathing hard, and Grant rested his forehead against hers. I want this to be a real marriage in every way, not just sharing a house but sharing a life, sharing a bed, if that is what you want too. It is. Grace had no doubt in her mind or heart. I want all of it. With you. That night, they came together as husband and wife in truth, and Grace found a tenderness and passion she had not known existed. Grant was patient and careful with her, mindful of her body's recent trauma, focused on her pleasure and comfort above his own. And when they lay tangled together afterward, the desert night cool against their skin, Grace felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. She had married this man out of necessity, but she loved him now by choice, and that made all the difference. As winter approached and the desert turned cold and harsh, Grace and Grant built their life together with increasing joy. The twins thrived, growing fat and healthy on milk and the abundance of food Grant provided. They began to smile and coo, responding to their parents' voices and faces. Samuel was the first to laugh, a surprised gurgle that made both Grace and Grant stop what they were doing and laugh themselves. Joseph followed a week later, his laugh louder and more frequent than his brother's. Grant proved himself not just a good provider but a devoted father. He played with the boys every evening, making funny faces and silly sounds that delighted them. He took them outside on warmer days, showing them the horses and chickens, talking to them in a gentle voice about everything they saw. And he was there for the night feedings and diaper changes, the crying and the colic, never complaining that these were not his blood children and therefore not fully his responsibility. Grace watched him with her sons and felt her love deepen day by day. She had loved Thomas in the way a young woman loves, with more passion than wisdom. But her love for Grant was different. It was built on partnership and respect, on shared struggles and mutual support. It was the kind of love that sustained rather than consumed, that grew stronger rather than burning out. On Christmas Eve, Grant came home with a small pine tree he had cut from the hills and a bag full of surprises. They decorated the tree with paper chains Grace made and strings of popcorn. They prepared together, while the twins watched from their cradles. Grant had purchased small gifts in Carson City. A new dress for Grace in a deep blue that matched her eyes, wooden rattles for the boys carved by a craftsman in town, and candy that they ate while sitting by the fire. "This is the best Christmas I have had in years," Grant said, watching Grace in her new dress with the firelight playing across her face. "Maybe the best ever. It is mine, too." Grace leaned against him, feeling safe and loved and grateful beyond measure. "Last Christmas, Thomas was still alive but already pulling away from me. He was obsessed with the mine, with finding the big strike that would make us rich. He barely noticed me or the fact that I was pregnant. And the Christmas before that, we were still settling in, still figuring out how hard life in Nevada was going to be. But this Christmas, I have everything I truly need. You and the boys and this home we have built together." "We have been blessed," Grant agreed. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Grace, I have something I want to ask you, or maybe tell you, I am not sure which." "What is it?" "When we married, it was an arrangement, a practical solution to both our problems. But it has become so much more than that, at least for me. You are not just my wife in name. You are my partner, my best friend, the woman I love more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And Samuel and Joseph, they are my sons now. Not because I have to claim them, but because I choose to. Because I cannot imagine my life without them or you. So what I want to say is this. I do not think of us as an arrangement anymore. I think of us as a real family, bound by choice and love. And I want to make sure you feel the same way. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but they were happy tears. I feel exactly the same way. You are not just the man who saved me from a desperate situation. You are my husband, the father of my children, the love of my life. This is real, Grant, as real as anything has ever been. They kissed then, deep and sweet, and the twins chose that moment to wake and demand attention with their powerful lungs. Grace and Grant pulled apart laughing, and together they attended to their sons, changing them and feeding them and settling them back down. And as Grace watched Grant cradle Joseph against his shoulder, patting his back and murmuring soft words, she knew that she had found something precious and rare. She had found a man who loved her not despite her circumstances, but including them, who had taken on her burdens and made them his own, who had proven every day since they met that he was a man of his word. Spring came to Nevada with wildflowers blooming briefly in the desert and the promise of longer days. The twins were 6 months old now, sitting up on their own and starting to eat soft foods in addition to milk. They were more alert and active, their personalities becoming even more distinct. Samuel was cautious and thoughtful, taking time to study new things before touching them. Joseph was bold and impulsive, grabbing for everything within reach and protesting loudly when told no. Grace had regained her strength fully, her body recovering from the difficult pregnancy and birth. She felt like herself again, or perhaps like a new version of herself, one tempered by hardship but also enriched by love and family. She and Grant had fallen into an easy partnership, dividing the work of home and children naturally, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the small victories. One afternoon in April, Mrs. Chen came to visit and check on the twins as she did periodically. She examined both boys, pronounced them healthy and thriving, then sat with Grace for tea while Grant played with them on a blanket in the main room. "You have done well," Mrs. Chen said, watching Grant make Samuel laugh by pretending to steal his nose. "Both of you. These boys are happy and loved, and that is what matters most." "I have been lucky," Grace said. "Grant is a wonderful father and husband. Luck had nothing to do with it." Mrs. Chen's dark eyes were shrewd. "You made a brave choice when you were desperate, and it turned out well. But it could easily have gone the other way. You trusted your instincts about him, and your instincts were correct. That is wisdom, not luck." Grace considered this. "Perhaps you are right. I did feel something when I first met him, some sense that he was genuine in his offer. But I was so afraid too. Fear is natural when we are vulnerable." Mrs. Chen sipped her tea. "But letting fear control our decisions is how we miss opportunities for happiness. You did not let fear stop you, and now look at what you have built." After Mrs. Chen left, Grace reflected on her words. It was true that accepting Grant's proposal had been an act of courage as much as desperation. She could have refused, could have tried to make it alone, and she would likely have failed and lost everything, including possibly her sons. But she had taken the risk of trusting a stranger, and that risk had paid off beyond anything she could have imagined. That evening, as they were putting the twins to bed, Grant was quieter than usual. Grace noticed but did not press, waiting to see if he would share what was on his mind. It was not until they were sitting together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky that he finally spoke. "I have been thinking about the future. Grant said. "About what I want for us and the boys." "What kind of thoughts?" Grace asked. "The ranch where I work is doing well, and the owner has said he wants to expand his operation. He offered me a position as foreman, which would mean more money and more responsibility. It would also mean longer hours, at least for a while as we bring in new stock and hire more hands. I wanted to discuss it with you before giving him an answer." Grace thought about this. More money would mean more security, the ability to save for the boys' futures and perhaps even buy their own property someday. But longer hours would mean less time with Grant, less help with the children, more burden falling on her shoulders. Still, they were a partnership now, and partnerships meant making decisions based on what was best for the family rather than what was easiest. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "If you take away the practical considerations, what would make you happy?" Grant was quiet for a moment. "I want to provide well for you and the boys. I want to give you a life where you do not have to worry about money or losing your home or any of the things that terrified you when I first met you. So yes, I want to take the position, but not if it means sacrificing too much time with my family. The money only matters if I have people to share it with. Then take it." Grace put her hand over his. "We will manage the longer hours. The boys are getting easier as they get older, and I am stronger now than I was. We will make it work because it is the right move for our future." Grant squeezed her hand gratefully. "You are sure, I am sure." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "We are a team, Grant. We figure things out together." Grant accepted the foreman position, and life became busier but also more prosperous. The extra money allowed them to save and to buy small luxuries that made life more comfortable. Better furniture, warmer clothes for winter, toys for the boys. Grant worked long days during the busy spring and summer months, often leaving before dawn and returning after sunset. But he never missed putting the boys to bed when he was home, and he always made time for Grace. The twins reached their first birthday in August, and Grace and Grant celebrated with a small party at their home. Mrs. Chen came, as did a few of the other families from town who had become friendly with them over the past year. There was cake that Grace had baked and lemonade made with precious lemons brought up from California. The boys were fascinated by the attention and the unfamiliar foods, Samuel cautiously tasting the cake while Joseph smeared it all over his face and hands. Grace stood in her kitchen watching Grant help Samuel blow out the candle on his small cake, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been desperate and alone, terrified of the future, and convinced she had no path forward. Now she had a husband who loved her, sons who were healthy and happy, a home that felt safe and permanent. She had not just survived, she had thrived, and it was all because a kind cowboy had offered to carry her burdens with her instead of walking past like so many others had. That night, after the guests had left and the boys were asleep, Grace and Grant lay together in bed talking quietly. "Thank you for this year," Grace said, "for everything you have given me and the boys. Thank you for trusting me enough to take a chance." Grant pulled her closer. "I know it was not easy to marry a stranger, but I hope I have proven myself worthy of that trust. You have proven it every single day." Grace kissed him softly. "I love you, Grant, not because you saved me, but because of who you are, because you are kind and patient and strong and good. Because you love my sons as your own and never make me feel less than your equal. Because you make me laugh and you listen when I talk and you hold me when I need holding. You are everything I never knew I needed. You are my heart," Grant said simply. "You and Samuel and Joseph. You are the reason I get up in the morning and the reason I work so hard. Everything I do is for you." They made love then with the tenderness and passion that came from true intimacy, from knowing each other's bodies and hearts, from choosing each other again and again. And afterward, lying in the darkness with Grant's arm around her, and the sound of her son's breathing softly in the next room, Grace felt a peace she had never experienced before. She was home in every sense of the word. The next 2 years passed quickly, marked by the small milestones of family life. The twins learned to walk, then to run, their sturdy legs carrying them all over the house and yard. They learned to talk, Samuel's first word being Mama and Joseph's being Dada, which made Grant's eyes shine with unshed tears. They were into everything, curious and energetic and exhausting in the way of all toddlers. But they were also affectionate and funny, quick to hug and kiss, full of laughter and joy. Grant continued as foreman at the Running Horse Ranch, and his skill at managing men and cattle earned him respect throughout the region. The owner increased his wages twice, and Grant began seriously discussing the possibility of eventually buying their own small ranch. It was a dream that felt impossible some days and tantalizing close on others, but it gave them something to work toward together. Grace resumed teaching in a limited way, offering lessons to the children of families who lived too far from town to attend the regular school. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic at her kitchen table 3 afternoons a week, while the twins played nearby, and the small income she earned went into their savings. She found she had missed teaching, missed the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes, and the work made her feel like herself again in ways beyond just being a mother and wife. They attended church most Sundays, sitting together in the small building that served as Sloan's Methodist congregation. The minister was a man who preached practical sermons about treating neighbors with kindness and working hard and accepting hardship with grace, messages that resonated with the frontier people who made up his flock. Grace found comfort in the familiar hymns and the sense of community, and she noticed the way other families looked at them with warmth rather than pity now. They were no longer the desperate widow and the kind stranger who had married her. They were Grant and Grace O'Brien and their twin sons, a family like any other, integrated into the life of the town. When the twins were 3 years old, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. The realization came with mixed emotions. She and Grant had discussed having more children, and both wanted to expand their family, but the memory of the difficult pregnancy and birth with the twins was still fresh enough to cause some anxiety. Still, this pregnancy felt different from the start. She was not alone this time, not desperate or afraid. She had Grant beside her, and that made everything easier. Grant was overjoyed at the news, his face lighting up with a happiness that warmed Grace to her core. "A baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Our baby. Yours and mine together." Grace had not thought about it in those terms, but he was right. This baby would be theirs in a way the twins were not, at least biologically. And yet Grant had never once treated Samuel and Joseph as anything less than his own sons, had never made any distinction between them and this new child on the way. That was just who he was, a man who loved completely and without reservation. The pregnancy progressed smoothly this time. Grace felt tired but not overwhelmed, sick in the mornings but able to manage. Grant hired a woman from town to help with the housework and watching the twins so Grace could rest, and he was even more attentive than usual, constantly checking on her and making sure she had everything she needed. The boys were fascinated by the idea of a new baby. They would pat Grace's growing belly and talk to their sibling, telling the baby about their toys and the horses and everything else they found important. Samuel was gentle and careful around Grace, seeming to understand instinctively that she was more fragile right now. Joseph was enthusiastic but clumsy, and Grant had to remind him frequently to be careful not to bump into Mama. In March of 1884, with spring just beginning to warm the desert air, Grace went into labor. This time it was faster and easier than with the twins, as if her body remembered what to do and did it more efficiently. Mrs. Chen attended again, her presence calm and reassuring, and Grant was there holding Grace's hand and murmuring encouragement through the contractions. Their daughter was born just after midnight, small but healthy, with a head full of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same blue as Grace's. Grace held her and wept with joy and relief, and when Grant touched his daughter's tiny hand, his face was transformed with wonder. "She is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named her Margaret Rose after both their mothers and called her Maggie from the start. The twins were enchanted with their baby sister, wanting to hold her and touch her constantly. Grant had to establish firm rules about being gentle. But even at 3 years old, Samuel and Joseph understood that Maggie was precious and needed to be protected. Watching Grant with Maggie was a revelation for Grace. He had been a wonderful father to the boys, but there was something different about seeing him with his biological daughter, a tenderness that bordered on reverence. He would hold her for hours, just staring at her tiny features as if memorizing every detail. He changed her diapers without complaint and walked the floor with her when she cried at night, singing off key lullabies that somehow always soothed her. "She has your eyes," Grace said one evening as she watched Grant give Maggie her bottle, "and your determination, I suspect." Grant smiled down at his daughter, who was sucking hungrily at the bottle while her small hands gripped his finger. "She knows what she wants and is not shy about demanding it, like someone else I know." Grace leaned her head on Grant's shoulder, feeling Maggie's warmth between them. "I still cannot believe she is real sometimes," Grant admitted. "That I have a daughter, that I have all of this. 5 years ago I was alone and directionless. Now I have a wife I love, 3 beautiful children, a good job, and a home. It feels like more than I deserve." "You deserve all of it and more." Grace kissed his cheek. "You are a good man, Grant O'Brien, the best man I have ever known. You deserve every happiness life can give you." As Maggie grew from infant to baby to toddler, the O'Brien family thrived. Grant had saved enough to make a down payment on a small ranch about 5 miles outside of Sloan, 50 acres with good water and enough grazing land for a modest herd of cattle. It was a risk and a huge amount of work, but it was theirs, and that made every hard day worth it. They moved to the ranch when Maggie was 18 months old, the twins now 5 and excited about having space to run and explore. The ranch house was small but solid, with 3 bedrooms and a kitchen big enough for Grace to work in comfortably. There was a barn that needed repairs and fences that needed mending and 100 other projects that would take years to complete. But they tackled them together, as a family. Grant hired 2 ranch hands to help with the cattle and the heavy labor, good men who were reliable and treated Grace and the children with respect. Grace managed the household and continued teaching a few students who rode out from town for lessons. The twins started attending the school in Sloan, riding in with one of the ranch hands each morning, and coming home full of stories about their friends and the things they were learning. Life on the ranch was hard work but deeply satisfying. They rose with the sun and fell into bed exhausted each night, but they were building something real and lasting. The cattle herd grew slowly but steadily. They added chickens for eggs and a milk cow for the children. Grace planted a garden that produced vegetables through the short growing season. They were not wealthy by any measure, but they had enough and more than enough of what truly mattered: love, family, purpose. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Grant surprised Grace with a gift that made her cry. It was a deed to the ranch, officially recorded with both their names listed as owners. Not just Grant as the head of household, but Grace as well, equal partners in the property as they were equal partners in life. "I wanted you to know that this is as much yours as mine," Grant explained as she stared at the document through her tears. "Everything we have built, we built together. You are not just my wife. You are my partner in every way. This ranch succeeds because of your hard work as much as mine. You deserve to have your name on it." Grace could not speak for a moment, too overcome with emotion. In 1886, it was rare for women to have property rights, to be recognized as equal owners rather than just dependents of their husbands. That Grant had done this, had made sure she had legal claim to their land, showed how much he valued and respected her. "Thank you," she finally managed. "This means more than you know. I know exactly what it means." Grant took her hands in his. "It means that we are truly partners, in law as well as in heart. It means that if something ever happens to me, you and the children are protected. It means that I see you and value you and want the world to see you the same way I do." They celebrated that night after the children were asleep, holding each other close and talking about the future they were building together. They spoke of expanding the herd, of maybe adding horses to sell, of watching their children grow up with space and freedom and security. They spoke of growing old together on this land they owned, of eventually seeing grandchildren running through these same rooms. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Grace confessed. "When I was sitting on that bench in Sloan 5 years ago, desperate and alone and terrified, I could not see any path forward that did not end in disaster. But you showed me a different path. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me purpose when I was drifting." Grant kissed her forehead. "We saved each other, Grace. That is what makes this work. Not one person rescuing the other, but both of us choosing to build something together." The years continued to pass, each one adding layers to their life together. The twins grew tall and strong, Samuel becoming serious and studious while Joseph remained energetic and mischievous. They helped on the ranch, learning to ride and rope and do the work of cowboys despite their young age. Maggie was her father's shadow, following him everywhere and insisting she could do everything her brothers could do, her determination making both Grace and Grant laugh, even as they marveled at her stubborn spirit. When Grace was 32 and Grant was 34, they had another child, a son they named Thomas Grant, honoring both Grace's first husband and the father who raised the boys Thomas had never known. The twins, now 10 years old, were old enough to help care for their baby brother, and Maggie at 6 was convinced she was his second mother. Little Thomas was a happy baby, easy and content, and his arrival felt like a blessing rather than a burden. The ranch prospered slowly but surely. Grant's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher spread, and they were able to hire more hands and expand their herd significantly. Grace's teaching expanded as well when several families in the area asked her to establish a proper school. She taught 20 students in a room Grant added onto their house, covering everything from basic reading to advanced mathematics for her older pupils. The small tuition fees the families paid added to their income, and more importantly, the work fulfilled Grace in ways that went beyond the practical. On Sundays, the O'Brien family rode into Sloan for church, and they were greeted warmly by neighbors and friends. They were no longer newcomers or oddities, but established members of the community, respected for their hard work and the loving family they had built. Grace sometimes thought about that desperate morning when she had stumbled down the sidewalk, 8 months pregnant and hopeless, and the transformation felt nothing short of miraculous. She said as much to Grant one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze, and Grace felt such contentment that it almost frightened her with its intensity. "We have been blessed," Grant agreed. He had aged well, his face lined now but still handsome, his body still strong from years of ranch work. "But we also worked hard for what we have. Blessings and effort, that is what builds a good life." "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Marrying me that day? Taking on all my problems and complications?" Grant turned to look at her with such love in his eyes that Grace felt her breath catch. "Not for a single moment. Not even once. You and our children are the best thing that ever happened to me. Every hard day, every challenge, every sacrifice has been worth it 1,000 times over. I love you." Grace took his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "I have loved you for so long now that I can barely remember not loving you. And I love you." Grant raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "My wife, my partner, my heart." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one in the vast Nevada sky. From inside the house came the sound of Samuel reading to Maggie while Joseph tried to teach baby Thomas to clap his hands. It was the sound of family, of home, of a life built on love and trust and mutual commitment. Grace thought about the journey that had brought her here, from desperate widow to beloved wife, from terrified and alone to surrounded by love and security. She thought about Grant's offer that morning in Sloan, how he had seen her struggling and said, in essence, "Let me carry these burdens with you." He had kept that promise in ways large and small every day since, sharing not just the difficulties but the joys, not just the work but the rewards. Their story was not one of grand romance or dramatic gestures. It was quieter than that, built on daily kindnesses and steady commitment. But it was real and deep and true, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that she would not trade it for anything else the world might offer. This was her life. These were her people. And she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the years rolled on into the 1890s, the O'Brien Ranch became one of the more successful operations in the region. Grant's careful management and Grace's financial acumen had turned their initial 50 acres into 200, their small herd into a significant one. They employed 6 full-time ranch hands and hired additional help during busy seasons. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, and to include a proper schoolroom, where Grace taught nearly 30 students now. The twins were 15, young men on the edge of adulthood, and Grant had begun teaching them the business side of ranching in addition to the physical work. Samuel showed an aptitude for record keeping and planning, while Joseph was a natural with the cattle and horses, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and intuition. Both boys knew that Grant was not their biological father, but it made no difference to any of them. He was their father in every way that mattered, and the love between them was evident in every interaction. Maggie, at 11, was turning into a young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. She could outride most of the ranch hands and had firm opinions about everything from cattle breeding to women's rights. Grace and Grant watched her with equal parts pride and amusement, knowing she would make her mark on the world in her own way and time. Little Thomas, now 4, was the baby of the family and delighted in that role. He followed his older siblings everywhere, trying to copy everything they did, and his arrival had reminded Grace and Grant of how quickly time passed, how precious each stage of childhood was before it slipped away forever. One evening in the fall of 1891, after the children were in bed, Grace and Grant took their customary walk around the property. It was their time to talk without interruption, to share their thoughts and dreams and concerns. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and above them, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a glowing river of stars. "I have been thinking about the future," Grace said as they walked hand in hand past the barn. "The twins will be men soon, ready to start their own lives." "What do you think they will do?" "Samuel has been talking about college," Grant said. "He wants to study business and agriculture at the university in Nevada. I think we can afford to send him if that is what he truly wants." "And Joseph? Joseph wants to stay on the ranch, I think. He loves this life in a way Samuel does not. I think eventually we will make him a partner, give him a stake in the operation so he knows he is building something for himself, not just working for us." Grace nodded, pleased that Grant had thought this through. "That seems wise." "And what about Maggie and Thomas? Have you thought about their futures?" "Maggie will go to college too if she wants it," Grant said firmly. "She is as smart as her brothers, and I will not have her limited just because she is a girl. As for Thomas, he has time. We will see what his gifts and interests are as he grows." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the ranch settling for the night around them. Cattle lowed softly in the distance, horses moved in their stalls, and an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. It was peaceful and familiar, this life they had built. "You remember the day we met?" Grace asked. 10 years ago this summer, I was sitting on that bench outside the general store, convinced my life was over." "I remember," Grant's voice was soft with memory. "You looked so tired but so determined not to give up. I admired that. I admire it still. You saved me that day. You know that, do not you? If you had not offered to help, I do not know what would have become of me and the twins." Grant stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands on her shoulders. "Grace, we have talked about this before. Yes, I helped you when you needed help, but you saved me too. I was a man with no purpose, no direction, just drifting through life waiting for something to give it meaning. You gave me that meaning. You and the children gave me a reason to stop wandering and start building. We saved each other. That is what love does. It makes both people better, stronger, more than they were alone." Grace reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "I love you, Grant O'Brien, today and always. And I love you." He kissed her then, deep and sweet, the kiss of a man who had chosen his wife every day for 10 years and would continue choosing her for all the days to come. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and as they climbed the porch steps, Grace looked back at the ranch spread out before them. The barn and corrals, the pastures stretching into the darkness, the land they had worked and built and poured their lives into. It was theirs, all of it, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they chose to carry their burdens together instead of alone. Inside, the house was quiet, their children sleeping peacefully in their beds. Grace and Grant checked on each one as they always did, covering Samuel where he had kicked off his blanket, retrieving the book that had fallen from Maggie's hands as she dozed, adjusting Thomas's pillow so he would not wake with a crick in his neck. They were parents, and this was their nightly ritual, the small acts of care that added up to love over time. In their own room, they prepared for bed with the ease of long familiarity. They spoke of tomorrow's plans, of the cattle that needed moving to a different pasture, of the supplies Grace needed for the school, of all the mundane details that made up a life. And then they climbed into bed together, and Grace fitted herself against Grant's side as naturally as breathing. "Happy?" Grant asked, his voice drowsy. "Immeasurably," Grace replied. "You? More than I ever thought possible." They drifted toward sleep together, and Grace's last conscious thought was gratitude. Gratitude for the cowboy who had stopped to help a desperate woman 10 years ago. Gratitude for the life they had built from that improbable beginning. Gratitude for love that had started as a practical arrangement and grown into something beautiful and enduring. She had been carrying twins alone, and Grant had said, "Let me carry them with you." He had kept that promise, and in keeping it, he had given her everything she needed to not just survive but thrive. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and challenges as all years do, but Grace and Grant faced them together. They celebrated Samuel's graduation from the University of Nevada and his decision to use his education to improve ranching practices throughout the region. They stood beside Joseph when he married a local girl and built his own house on the far end of their property, starting his own family while remaining part of the ranch operation. They sent Maggie to a women's college in California, where she studied to become a teacher like her mother, determined to make education available to girls who might otherwise have none. They watched Thomas grow into a young man who combined his father's steadiness with his mother's love of learning, eventually becoming a veterinarian who served the ranching communities throughout northern Nevada. They welcomed grandchildren, bouncing babies who called them grandmother and grandfather, and filled their house with new laughter and joy. And through it all, through every season and change, Grace and Grant remained partners. They aged together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming spotted with age, their bodies slowing with the inevitable march of time. But their love only deepened, becoming richer and more precious with each passing year. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they renewed their vows in the same small church where they had first married. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, and the church was full of friends and neighbors who had watched their love story unfold over 3 decades. When Grant slipped a new gold band onto Grace's finger alongside the original one she had worn all these years, his hands trembled slightly with age and emotion. "You are still the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known," Grant said, his voice wavering but clear. "You were carrying twins alone, and I asked to carry them with you. But the truth is, you have carried me too. Through every day of these 30 years, your strength and love have carried me. I am grateful beyond words for the life we have built together." Grace, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, took his hands in hers. "You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I would never love again. You gave me a family and a home and a partnership that has sustained me through everything life has thrown our way. I would choose you again, Grant O'Brien. Today and every day, I would always choose you." They kissed to the applause and cheers of everyone gathered. And as Grace looked out at the faces of her children and grandchildren, all of them here because a kind cowboy had stopped to help a desperate woman 30 years ago, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude and joy. Her life had been hard at times, marked by loss and struggle, but it had also been beautiful beyond measure. She had loved and been loved, had built something lasting and good, had raised children who were now raising children of their own. That night, after the celebration was over and they were alone again in the house that had been their home for so many years, Grace and Grant sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. The Nevada night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead, and from the direction of Joseph's house came the sound of one of the grandchildren laughing. 30 years, Grace mused. It has gone so fast. And so slow, Grant added. Every day with you has been a gift, but strung together, they feel like a lifetime. It has been a lifetime, our lifetime. Grace leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders in the gesture that had comforted and anchored her for 3 decades. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not stopped that day? If you had just walked past like everyone else. Sometimes, Grant admitted, and it frightens me to think about it. All of this, everything we have built, every happy moment, every child and grandchild, none of it would exist if I had made a different choice that morning. It makes me grateful I listened to my instinct to help. I am grateful too. Grace turned to look at him, this man who had been her salvation and her partner and her great love. For your kindness, for your strength, for choosing me every single day since that first one. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grant O'Brien. And you are mine. Grant kissed the top of her head. My wife, my love, my heart, until my last breath and beyond. They sat together under the stars, two people who had found each other in desperate circumstances and built a love story that would endure. It was not the kind of romance found in books, with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. It was quieter than that, built on daily choices and steady commitment, on carrying each other's burdens and sharing each other's joys. But it was real and true and lasting. And as Grace drifted toward sleep with Grant's arm around her, and the sounds of her family settling for the night around them, she knew with absolute certainty that she had been blessed beyond measure. She had been carrying twins alone, and the cowboy had said, "Let me carry them with you." He had, and in doing so, he had given her everything. A family, a home, a love that would last forever, and that was more than enough. That was everything.